I want to make sure that I stress that the global threats, I'm not behind them. Okay, that's not my job to cause them. My wife may say differently, but no. I just want to say a couple of words quickly about why I'm here, why I'm thankful to be here, and it's related to the Giddy Up piece. So I retired after 34 years working for the federal government, mainly in the intelligence community, and when I retired last year, my assessment was I've never seen our country facing so many threats, so many multiple and dangerous threats on a daily basis. And I wanted to do something to continue giving back in a different way, and I'm very thankful that Corey and I got to talk, and I am now associated with ICIT, which I think has an incredibly important mission. I'm excited to be part of the mission, and I thank all of you for supporting the mission and being part of the mission as well, including our panelists. We have a great panel today. I want to introduce them, have them come up to the table, and we're going to start our discussion on trying to explain the threat picture that we see today, and we couldn't have four better panelists to do this given their experience in government and in the private sector. So to start with, Professor Paula Doyle. Paula is a retired CIA officer. I have to say she was also my boss at one time, so I have to be very careful. She knows I'm a terrible speller. Paula is now a professor at Georgetown University, and she is also very active in the private sector and has a great background in the cyber field. And I'm just very thankful to have her here and having agreed to come speak. Dr. Mussington, welcome to you, sir. For those of you that do not know Dr. Mussington, he is Assistant Deputy Director for Infrastructure Security at CISA. Again, couldn't have somebody more experienced and in such an important position and key role today in the government working on protecting our critical infrastructure. So thank you for joining us, sir. Dana Madsen, welcome. Deputy Director of Cyber Threat Intelligence Center at the DNI. And absolutely a key role now and probably one of the most challenging roles in government, I would say. So also thank you for coming today and being part of the panel. And Gabriel Agboruche, Executive Director for OT and Cybersecurity, Jacobs. Also, I did a little research before the panel. Wow, just an incredible background and expertise. So for our panel, I want to start out by just asking a question, and I open it up to you guys to decide who will answer, or maybe a collective answer. Probably the way that we're going to win the war on defending our critical infrastructure is through collaboration, so we'll start here at the panel. But earlier this year, Director Wray, in testimony to Congress and in some public statements, talked about the persistent threat posed by the PRC to our critical infrastructure, including in the cyber realm. I would like to ask the panel, many of us know that this threat has been going on for, before January of this year. It's been going on for a long time. We can go back to the OPM hack in 2015, which was a serious attack against our critical infrastructure. But during his statement, the director mentioned that he was hoping to find more engagement and more attention from the U.S. public to this problem set. So for the panel's members, I'd like to ask, one, do you think that this statement to Congress and kind of exposing what the PRC is doing has modified their behavior at all in their threats to the critical infrastructure of this country? And have we seen an uptick or greater engagement between the public and private sector with the U.S. government and the organizations tasked with protecting our critical infrastructure? So.
Good morning. I think that the Volt Typhoon activity, which is what the PRC activity is known under the moniker for that's something that we absolutely continue to track in the government. And you see evidence of that through the various advisories that continue to be published to ensure that critical infrastructure owners and operators are aware of that threat. And I think the Volt Typhoon threat is an interesting manifestation in the cyber threat landscape, because 10 years ago, when we looked at the global cyber threat environment, it was primarily driven by cyber espionage as one of the key drivers of the threat. But over the past year to 2 years, in different ways, we've seen an inflection in the threat environment to where cyber attack is also a consideration. And cyber espionage is still a threat, but now the landscape has become much more complex, the threat landscape, because we have to think about both issues. Volt Typhoon is one manifestation of that. And it's one that does demand significant integration across government and also with the private sector because of the sophistication of the tradecraft that the actors are using. They're basically conducting pre-operational reconnaissance and network exploitation on networks owned by critical infrastructure. But there are two aspects of their tradecraft that are very sophisticated. One is a technique called living off the land. So once they get access to a system, they blend in with normalcy on the system. So it looks like normal system administration activity. There's not a strong signature. The other aspect of this is how they operate and hide their activities on the internet, because they work from red space overseas, but they use networks of compromised routers, SOHO routers, think like what you might have at your home, where they're not necessarily patched or they're beyond life. And it provides opportunity to obfuscate their activities and makes tracking them complex. And because of those two aspects, this activity is at one end of the spectrum and certainly has geopolitical implications. The DNI, in her threat testimony earlier this year, talked about Beijing potentially looking at, in a time of crisis or conflict, using cyber attack to try to slow the flow of U.S. military forces in a regional conflict. And I think because of the nature of this threat, it does require that integrated response, because we have to blend what we know from intelligence, law enforcement, also cyber defense, and the private sector to put together the pieces, because we each have a picture of understanding this activity and the threat landscape.
If I could just add to what my colleague said, I think that the landing zone for a lot of the Volt Typhoon and other activity is critical infrastructure, and that means that the private sector often has insights about risk impacts before we do in the public sector, which means that public-private partnership is a fundamental requirement for early warning and response and resilience planning. So as national coordinator, CISA depends on its private sector partners to allow it, in a sense, to get a little bit earlier tipping of adversary activity. We can work on, with the private sector and internally and with our interagency partners, on critical infrastructure impacts that affect mission. Just as an example, think about the defense critical infrastructure impacts of denials of service of the kind that CrowdStrike represented. Under the right circumstances, that can have real impact on the ability of the USG and DoD to do things in a timely way that can have real impact on outcomes. So we're very outcome oriented, and it means that in advance, we know about living off the land, we know about Volt Typhoon, we know about other empowered actors that imitate those TTPs. In advance, we need to link that surveillance, that insight, with resilience responses to make us all better defended. It's too late almost to do it after you start to see the actor present. You need to be proactively engaged with the private sector to make sure that you're situationally aware. That's a fundamental requirement.
Speaking of that proactive approach, most of my experiences have primarily been there within dealing with the private sector, right? As a practitioner, getting into the environment, executing proactive services. And in many cases, especially at Jacobs, we're currently working with many of the targets of Volt Typhoon within the water and wastewater sectors, right? In over 250 or so facilities. So it really places us in a position of being very proactive. When our customers see something, we are the ones that are there in order to respond. Or there's times where there needs to be some levels of preparedness as it concerns tabletop exercises or even penetration tests or even threat hunting or threat modeling, right? And really looking at those TTPs from a Volt Typhoon or a Frosty Goop, which is another threat actor that has come out, right? The names are pretty interesting, but they really represent a lot of the current activities that's happening. So that proactive approach with the private sector and also partnering with the public sector is definitely one of the approaches that I think many organizations and our critical infrastructure should take.
So I would just say I've been out of government for a few minutes, and so my comments are more directed at what I saw before I left government, and in the context of what the senator asked and putting words together, most of what I work on these days is educate, inform, and inspire. My job is to help inspire you to wake up. So what do I mean by that? How many of you had data in the OPM hack? almost the whole room. Lucky day, you get to wake up in your homes. The adversaries have your home address, which means they know where your home router is, which means you're a target. If you're China, Russia, Iran, you are a permanent government employee. You are fair game. Hate to tell you. And you don't have your own cybersecurity expert. But you might have an alarm, and you might have a way to check to make sure nobody's coming in the front door, right? The public-private conversation is so important because those of you who are in or used to be in government, you know what unusual looks like, or you should be curious enough to explore that. If you just had a new router put into your home and you've got new so-called 5G, and you can get me really involved in a long conversation on what a fake that is, if you don't have signal strength in your house and you have just input all kinds of new things in your house, you got to ask yourself a question. Don't just call Verizon. What is going on? And this is the attack vector that former government employees, current government employees have to deal with. And I'm not sure we're talking about that enough. So I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to inform, educate, and hopefully inspire you. Be part of a very curious, energetic, proactive knowledge base that you've been hacked, you've been had, you're fair game. Russia, China, and Iran do not care if you are not currently an employee. You are an attack vector. You have, look, how would you like to be called by the FBI and be accused of having sabotaged a network? This is possible, right? So we can't do this fast enough or better enough, and I'm very excited to be part of an opportunity to wake you up, inspire you to think a little more carefully about what might be even happening in your own homes, your small businesses. You might think you have no intellectual property of interest, but you are the intellectual property of interest. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Paula.
May I add one other point? Because I think to Paula's point, we are, and also in the private sector, on the front lines for the cyber threat. And there's one other manifestation as we look at the attack threat. There's on the one end of the spectrum, Volt Typhoon, but we've also seen a threat from non-state hacktivists, for example, pro-Russian hacktivists, or Corey mentioned Alaquipa, Pennsylvania, that was targeted by Cyber Avengers, which are Iran-affiliated hacktivists. And it's another aspect of the threat that affects and threatens, puts critical infrastructure at risk in different ways. In this case, these are actors that are opportunistically scanning for security weaknesses on critical infrastructure and exploiting them. And they do that to gain notoriety. And oftentimes, critical infrastructure owners and operators, for a variety of reasons, because of finances, business imperatives, burdens of other responsibilities, such as physically maintaining the system, don't always have the ability to put in place the security that they need to put in place, and don't always recognize that they're a potential target for actors acting overseas. We've seen this manifest most recently over the past 6 months, where some of these actors have been able to cause cyber-physical effects. You may note that Treasury, on the 19th of July, sanctioned two leaders of a group called CAR, Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, that had opportunistically taken advantage and caused some of these physical effects. And so it's another dimension of the threat environment, particularly as you look at a geopolitical crisis, that you could see this type of a manifestation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just one additional point. Anybody from the Infrastructure Security Division at CISA has to mention physical threats and sabotage. It's important to understand the additive impact, maybe the multiplicative impact of physical access to a critical asset, and what can happen when connectivity is interrupted or connectivity is disrupted as a tangent to something else. And I think that, the recent fiber cuts in France and the sabotage of conduit near rail in France is indicative of the old stuff still works. The old stuff can still cause disruptions. And we might think we're more resilient because we have cyber systems, but per Paula's point, that might be exactly wrong. So there's no escape from this. Resilience is the way out.
Thank you for raising that. My next question was, what are we learning from the war in Ukraine and the way that the Russians are prosecuting that war, both in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine? And do you assess that there is a threat, a physical threat to the infrastructure of this country, given what we've seen with some alleged Russian activities in Europe?
I think that a funny term I mentioned earlier was frosty goop, right? It's actually the identification of a threat group that was able to cause disruptions, right, during the Russian-Ukrainian war to a HVAC system or heating and cooling system, right? This was this was initiated by a cyber attack specifically, and it kind of brings me back to a lot of my early career. I used to work at a nuclear facility as a nuclear instrumentation and controls engineer. And for those who are familiar with another term or another name for some malware called Stuxnet. Stuxnet was a Middle Eastern, right, malware that hit a nuclear facility and caused shockwaves across the world. And it hit my little nuclear plant where we started to have to implement cybersecurity guidance broadly, right? So I think that, as you were mentioning, that, hey, the Russian-Ukrainian war is showing how our adversaries are evolving, are educating themselves on new tactics and techniques. Some old, really, right? Some old. They utilize industrial protocols called one called Modbus in order to cause this type of attack. But yes, I do think that it is causing, CIOs. Jack would speak to CIOs, CISOs, and CEOs. It's making them more aware of, hey, seeing that this happened across the world, what do I need to do to protect my own environment and my own organization from these type of attacks?
Just to add to those remarks, I think that Ukraine has a lot of lessons for the democracies that are interested in protecting their critical infrastructure collaboratively. So you've had a sort of a renaissance of Western countries, especially NATO, European Union, countries as far afield as Australia, New Zealand, collaborating to help Ukraine out. So basically technical assistance, risk and threat information sharing, private sector is being critical in helping Ukraine keep infrastructures either lit or operating after kinetic attack. So I think that partnership and preparedness have shown themselves as very useful. Obviously, public-private partnerships, some of it volunteer, some of it coordinated through governments, is also important. So you've had a lot of private sector companies that have volunteered to help Ukraine in terms of both threat information and in terms of recovery and resilience planning. I think it's important for deterrence, given who the threat actor is in Ukraine, for Western countries to understand, and in some foreign travel I've done recently in Australia, New Zealand, and Western Europe, I think this understanding is strong that what Russia is trying to do to Ukraine is try technique out that may have facility elsewhere. And that's obviously countries like Poland and Germany are laser focused on that reality. They're our allies, and we have mission dependencies and obligations to some of those countries. We should pay attention because their critical infrastructure, security and resilience is in a sense our critical infrastructure, security and resilience. And I think that's why there's a strong rationale for us to support Ukraine as they try and secure their country. And I think that, no, they're not a NATO ally, but they do represent a lot of the values that we represent here. And their ability to defend themselves and stay viable as a state, denying Russia its preferences, which is either domination or elimination of Ukraine as an independent country, is a great deterrence through denial message. And I think that that shows that even under exigent circumstances, critical infrastructures can still operate if you're prepared enough, if you're resilient enough. And with our help, hopefully that continues to be the case.
I think we continue to watch, and both we and our adversaries will continue to watch how the cyber dynamic plays out in the Ukraine conflict, and certainly with our allies. And I think we don't fully understand that as the conflict's still ongoing. I will add one dimension to this, which is the safe haven that's provided for non-state actors that allows them to operate, whether it's car or ransomware actors, to cause disruption. And what does that mean as a means of geopolitical influence for Russia, just in providing safe haven, or the potential for connections between the state and those actors? And I think that's another factor to look at from the geopolitical standpoint and look at and try to understand the significance of.
What brilliant answers from all of you. I would add, I would step back a bit, Glenn, and look at, how does Russia operate, and I would go beyond Ukraine and look at Syria and look at Africa. And here's what I would try to back up just a little bit from that perspective and say, when we say Russia in this context, Ukraine, Syria, Africa, you obviously think about the government, but think also about the oligarchs. Think also about the organized criminals that have been running big portions of that country since the Soviet Union fell, and proxies like Wagner. When you think about that whole big picture, what we learn is how Russia's instruments of power can play out in your neighborhoods against far more than the energy sector. We're watching that play out very carefully in Ukraine. But don't forget banks. Don't forget media. And that's not just social media, that's also just plain old newspapers and magazines and television journalism. Hospitals, healthcare. And when I say healthcare, okay, here's another big group of data that I hope will inspire you. Our hospital systems have been hacked a number of times. I kind of doubt most of us have true privacy, despite HIPAA, with respect to whatever medicines we're taking and what diseases we have. I'm not real comfortable with Russians having my blood type or my DNA. What does that mean from a CRISPR perspective? What does that mean from a geobiome? What does that mean? Does it mean that now they not only know me and where I live, but they can make me look something different? They can cause me to have a concussion. They can do great harm. They can skip the government level. Transportation, as you've noted. Agriculture and food supplies. I don't think we talk about that enough. My father raised cattle throughout his entire life. I grew up around farms and animals. We had a pretty good sense in our neighborhood who was who in the zoo. We knew when a stranger came to town, and usually they got a cup of coffee and a cookie and a welcome to town. But every once in a while, someone would come into town and go, "Who are you? What are you doing snooping around my cattle? What are you doing snooping around my farm?" We have to be careful about the seeds and be careful about the animals that we are then consuming, and think very careful about how we are going about protecting that from a very different kind of asymmetric warfare. And I do say the word war. We have a very interesting definition of war in the 21st century. And Russia, Iran, and China bump right up against it. And I think Ukraine is showing us just how far the Russians will scoot forward and then they'll come back, and how we're seeing with the islands in the in East Asia, how far China will go in building a little bit more real estate, and pretty soon it's all there. And you see what Iran is doing in the world today. And it's not just in its next door neighborhood borders. It's quite far away from its borders. So the other thing I would say is all of us pay taxes, right? Do we?
I do. Just want to stress, I pay my taxes.
How many of you are filing electronically? Just about everybody. So if I were the enemy, what would I look at? You've already gone after OPM. I'm pretty sure they could go after something else that everybody uses. What else does everybody use? We either pay into it or we take out from it. What is that? Yeah, how's that network working for you? There are many ways in our open, free, wonderful society that help make us tick and run and be healthy and bold and secure and free that are also our Achilles heels. So I hope to inspire that conversation. I'm sure Russia knows, and I'm sure Iran knows, and I'm sure China knows.
Thank you, Paula. Although now I am really depressed. The senator didn't do it, but wow. Okay, so the senator did mention the CrowdStrike incident. I did want to ask the panel, what lessons learned can we take from that incident? You know, it's not a state actor or a non-state actor. It's just something that happened, which wasn't good, and it caused a lot of damage and disruption. And I'm still, by the way, trying to get my baggage back. I won't name the airline, but, because I was traveling when this happened. But how do we make lemonade out of lemons here? What can we take away from that experience?
I think there's between that incident, but also recent incidents that have affected the automobile sector, Senator Hickenlooper mentioned that, and also the healthcare sector, the ability to fill prescriptions and get insurance authorizations. Those types of incidents show a challenge in critical infrastructure where there may be unseen choke points that are common software protocols that underlie the infrastructure. And that is a dynamic that can be exploited either by human error, or it could be triggered by human error, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, or it could be by happenstance, an adversary, a ransomware actor, just happens to hit the right target, doesn't realize beforehand the effects that they'll cause. And so it is a dynamic that's out there. I think that there's a challenge for our adversaries in understanding some of those choke points that underlie the sectors, but I think it's also a consideration for us to think about that. And I think all of these incidents highlight that as one type of a consideration in critical infrastructure resilience.
I think at times, the way that we can look at it is that it was a failure of resilience, right? There was an update that went out that wasn't particularly tested. It caused disruptions across so many different industries and sectors, specifically in critical infrastructure. And I think that it's really important for organizations to be able to prepare, not necessarily predict, but work within their organization to prepare for the worst day, right? Incident preparedness, understanding your weaknesses and your vulnerabilities in your cyber infrastructure, but also your technology infrastructure. Single points of failure is a thing that's really big. So I think that organizations should look to prepare for the worst day. More specifically speaking about for cyber, many times when we come in and to do an assessment, we're already focusing on saying, once the adversary or once the bad thing already happened, what more can the bad guys do, right? An assumed breach type of perspective. So I think then in preparing for the worst day, but even when the worst day happens, what is our response? I think that that's all a part of that resilience discussion that organizations need to have more and more.
Just a couple of things. I think one thing it teaches us is a little bit of humility in terms of what we know and don't know, because we talk a lot about interdependencies and how risks can propagate across critical infrastructure, but I don't know anybody who predicted the kind of scale impacts that happened from this, which is sort of a data file flaw, not a software update flaw. Importantly, differentiating those two. I think that's one thing. So humility is first lesson. I think second, the cross-infrastructure impacts were obviously international. So the international scale of those things, for me, and I'm sort of a old-time cyber doctrine, cyber strategy person, I thought about, we've seen a weapon system demonstrated that we didn't know was feasible. Doesn't mean that anybody predicted that that weapon system was feasible, but now people know it is. So what TTPs can be enabled by that knowledge, either by Russia, China, third-party, criminal, combination of those things. We have something called the Kev list that we publish every day. Anybody who sees me on LinkedIn will know that most of my posts are Kev list updates. These are known exploitable vulnerabilities that exist in the ether for years that are constantly under exploitation. In ones and twos, they're significant. When you chain them together, often a Kev list that is a CV value of sort of 2 or 3 can end up a 7 or 8 or 9 or more. So think of chaining Kev list exploitable vulnerabilities with something like what was just demonstrated. And you were looking at a new class maybe of vulnerability that we all need to worry about or be inspired by, to quote Paula. We talk a lot about secure by design at CISA, and it's really key. Secure by design is not just a hardware or a software architecture point, though. It's also a business process point. What about the process that allowed this content file to be distributed? Were there checks in that process? And I don't know the process, so these are these are questions and I don't know who was responsible for that process of testing. Clearly, something happened that doesn't always happen because those sensors are often updated. So something didn't work here, and there's a business process reasons probably embedded in that rationale. So I think in all of those areas, we've got lessons learned. The one that keeps me awake at night is a brand new weapon system that nobody knew you could trigger, that was triggered, and I wonder if someone else is going to try something similar.
Yeah, not much to add to that. I think I heard this morning that the lawsuits have now been filed against CrowdStrike, and I guess my reaction to that is if it was unintentional, when at CIA things would come up and things would go badly sometimes, right? Just it's the world, and the investigation and the management reviews were generally was there sloth or sloppiness involved. Sloth is never good. Don't be lazy. Sloppiness, just as bad. Both imply a sense of negligence. And I don't know the extent to which there will be a productive legal discussion about negligence on the part of whomever, and it would probably be many layers. I do know, having a little bit of experience with things that go well and things that don't go well at CIA, we have to be able to move on from it. A lot of our companies are using CrowdStrike for lots of good reasons. And what I would worry about is that some companies are really dependent upon what that thing is. And so while undergoing the investigation, I would hope that there's a pause or a stay while everybody tries to figure it out. And on the other side, since Glenn and I sort of have a different sort of background in spotting, assessing, developing, and recruiting foreign agents, I would want to know if somebody at CrowdStrike was recruited. I would want to know, because this is what Russia, China, and Iran do. They recruit people who work in companies that are involved in just about every sector of our economy. And that would be a great target. I'm not saying it happened. I'm just saying, as a case officer, I would have to think about that. I would have to think about the insider threat. Was there one? It takes longer than a minute to figure that out, by the way. So be patient. So that's just sort of an observation.
Yeah, and kind of even maybe a slightly positive twist to it is I think that it's a revelation to the lack of resilience within a lot of these organizations. So I'm sure that the CrowdStrike competitors or CrowdStrike-like organizations are like, I don't want to be in that situation. I don't want to be in. So they're probably most likely, evaluating their processes, getting firms to come in to really make sure that that a CrowdStrike-like event wouldn't happen again, and maybe even training is happening. So I think that that's another thing, right? On the other end of it, I'm sure that organizations are being more vigilant to not be in that same situation. And I know that even within the electrical sector, we always speak about grid, right? Our lack of resilience within our grid infrastructures, and I think that that's another thing that's very important is to reveal the weaknesses before we can fix them.
Thank you. So going back to my original question about Director Ray's testimony and the threat from the PRC, and of course we also mentioned other threat actors, my experience in the intelligence community is that operationalizing intelligence can be very challenging when you have to disrupt a threat, and that's what you do at the table. That's kind of your jobs. How are we doing there, and what are the lessons we're learning in terms of being able to share intelligence with the private sector, and the private sector being able to share intelligence or information with the government to make sure that we're warning people and stopping threats before they cause serious damage?
I think the Volt Typhoon activity is a good driver to think about that. And I think that we see that imperative of having that integration between the intelligence community, law enforcement, sector risk management agencies, and private sector. We see that reflected in the recently issued National Security Memorandum 22 on critical infrastructure resilience. And if you look at that, there's a section that includes intelligence and intelligence sharing and information exchange. The NSM puts an impetus on the IC to think about how do we support critical infrastructure owners and operators with our government partners. And that's something that we are actively looking at in different ways because it's a non-traditional muscle for the intelligence community. With the private sector with critical infrastructure on the front line, that's a different customer set. And so we are looking very closely at how do we support that new customer set. And in many cases, it's how do we make our information more useful and shareable by our law enforcement and sector risk management agency partners that are the face of the government to these entities. And I think that there's a couple of dynamics that are important in looking at this in terms of how do we better, from an intelligence standpoint, support this critical infrastructure customer set. One is understanding how the private sector, the different sectors operate. What are the business dynamics that shape the equipment they use, the security posture, the level of training, the regulatory and other challenges, the constraints under which they operate that shape their business processes? What are the key aspects of their systems that are systemically important where if something goes down, it causes widespread effects? And it's also understanding what type of intelligence is most actionable and what is their capacity and ability to receive intelligence in terms of just understanding the threat landscape. And one aspect of that is also their ability to handle whether it's classified or unclassified information. So there's a lot of texture to think about on that. And as we look at carrying out the imperatives that we have as the intelligence community under NSM 22, we are looking at, with our partners in the government, how to make that intelligence most actionable to our private sector partners, how to understand the priority intelligence requirements for the sectors that are out there so that we can best provide collection and analysis support. And I think in another aspect, which we've been very focused on at the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center, CTIC at the ODNI, is partnerships. Thinking about the right partnerships, our ability as ODNI to convene the intelligence community, our government partners, and private sector entities to gain greater insight into infrastructure operations, and also to think about how we incorporate the excellent information that's available from the commercial cybersecurity industry into our analysis in ways that potentially allow us to maybe take insights that might be gleaned through sensitive sources and methods and make them shareable and actionable with our critical infrastructure partners through our sector risk management agency partners.
Absolutely. And just three quick insights. One is taking advantage of a lot of those threat intelligence feeds for organizations tailored to what their sectors and their industries and their markets are. Utilizing a Google Cloud Mandiant threat intelligence feeds or a Dragos threat intelligence feeds is something that a lot of times, Jacobs, we always recommend to our customers to be able to take advantage of. Another one that you mentioned was the known exploited vulnerabilities that you always post on LinkedIn. I've seen them, and I've also been stopped by them in performing red teaming and penetration testing type of services, right? So those will expose what is currently out there from the adversaries. And another one is also information sharing across industries. These are these things called ISACs, or information sharing organizations, where it's in the energy sector, all different levels of critical infrastructure. I think those are three of the areas that I think it's very important.
Just to focus on what NSM allows us to do that we couldn't do before. The NSM 22 makes, of course, CISA the national coordinator for critical infrastructure security and resilience. Now, how much does that change what we used to do to what we do now? It makes us do new risk assessments for each one of the critical infrastructure sectors. Prior set of infrastructure assessments under the old PPD 21 regime peaked in 2015, and then we're allowed to just sit. So we're refreshing cross-infrastructure risk awareness using the best IC insights, the best threat intelligence insights from the private sector, and the best domain expertise from those private sector companies, often which have built capability over time. So we have a much higher level of capability among critical infrastructure companies, some of which they share with us, some of which they don't, for reasons which we all are aware of. Here, I think that the partnership between the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative Act, CISA, for example, and companies like Google, companies like Microsoft and others, has created a new level of trust that allows pre-incident sharing of information sometimes classified, sometimes at the FOUO level, that allows much better shared situational awareness. It enables things like ransomware pre-notification, for example, which is a capability that I sort of didn't believe was feasible, but it obviously is feasible because hundreds of instances of preventing hospitals, public authorities, and others from being crypto-locked prior to the adversary's preferences because of indicators that we generated with linking IC and private sector insights. So that's happened in the United States. It's happened with some of our French partners, Australia as well, where preventing ransomware victimization is a deliverable service, and we're trying to take that from pilot to a more broad, usable functionality. I think revolutionizing SRMA roles and missions, or Sector Risk Management Agency roles, giving them more formal responsibilities for risk reduction in critical infrastructures, means that rather than just observing risk, it's about converging on that risk and identifying reduction scenarios and courses of action, which the private sector can adopt or be incentivized to adopt to reduce risk that would otherwise scale up out of control. So the aspirations are more ambitious, I suppose. The capability to collaborate is greater because of the threat intelligence insights we're already observed about. Functionally, that Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative is a new institutional mechanism within CISA. It's got counterparts at the interagency level as well that allows more efficient sharing of less than classified information so that it can actually be used. The real challenge, of course, with classified information is that it's of limited utility because you can't share it with people who aren't cleared. And we still have to surpass that hurdle of having TSSCI risk insights that you can share with one person who can't share it with anybody else. That is not useful. Getting it into shareable, tear line defined categories is necessary.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you to our panelists. Hopefully you're still going to be around so people can ask questions and mingle with you a little bit after the panel. But thank you very much for your time and for all your input, and it's great to see you, and it was great to work with my old boss again, Paula. Thank you, everybody.